Hi, I'm Jamie Noguchi, and welcome to Draw Jam. Let's fucking make comics! Draw Jam! Welcome back. So last time I talked a little bit about my motivations for setting up this online course or series of videos or whatever the hell I'm going to be calling it. And today I wanted to go over the 5 basic lessons that I'm going to cover and then jump right into the first one. So lesson 1 is going to focus on the language of comics, which is all about page layout and panel layout and what goes into a panel, a little bit about lettering, but not too deep because I don't consider myself a very good letterer. Number 2, I want to talk about blocking, which is how we place our characters within a scene. There are some fun tricks that you can use if your scene is dialogue heavy. There's also some fun tricks, cheats we can use to make it look like 2 people are looking at each other when really they'd be staring off in the distance in real life. But you know, we got some cheats that we can use in comics. Number 3, I want to talk about story. Ways to structure a story for long form comics or short form comics or gag a day, that kind of stuff. 4th, I'm going to be talking about publishing, mostly focusing on self-publishing because I have yet to work with a traditional publisher, so I don't have much helpful information on that. But if that changes within the time that I get to that, I'll let you know. But most of that's going to be focused on self-publishing, getting your work out to a large number of people online and publishing in print if you choose to go that route. And then finally, number 5, lesson 5, I'm going to be talking about marketing, which is also something that I'm not quite the best at, but I want to give you as much information as I can, and maybe if you guys have some thoughts about marketing, you could share that with me. So that's going to be the whole thing, all 5 of those things the next 5 weeks, give or take, depending on whether or not I can get my act together and get these things out there in a timely fashion. So, lesson 1, the language of comics. We're going to talk about page layout, how to set up your panels and what to put in your panels, and how to guide a reader's eye through a page and make it easy to read. You don't want to fight your reader for attention and stuff. You want to make it easy as possible for them to read a thing. Most of this is going to be a demo in Photoshop, but it doesn't really matter what program you use for this. This is just so I can give you some visual aids as I jibba jabba along. All right, before I get started, I want everybody to know I'm using a really old version of Photoshop. I don't want you to get hung up on what brushes I'm using or the keyboard shortcuts or any of that bullshit, because this is not a Photoshop tutorial. This is about the language of comics. So I'm using Photoshop because it's easy to demonstrate instead of trying to figure out how to film like a big ass chalkboard and that kind of stuff. The other thing I want you to recognize is that a lot of this stuff is going to be familiar to you, especially if you've been reading comics all of your life. This is stuff you see every time you open up a book and read it. And so it's obvious it should be familiar, but you might not have been thinking about it from a creator's standpoint. So that's what this lesson is really about, to get you in the head of somebody planning out a page, figuring out what to stick inside it and all that kind of stuff. All right, so I'm just going to hop into it. Now, this is from a Western perspective, and in the West, we read things from left to right. Oops. And top to bottom. Boom. So this is important when it comes to laying out a lot of panels on a page. If you are doing political cartoons, this is not so much a problem. This is the frame you're working with. If you're doing like joke a day, newspaper strip style comics, you know, this is what you're working with. This is 3 or 4 panels. This is very easy. This is, you know, so this is where you live. Or, you know, sometimes there's 3 panels, or sometimes you want to break it up into like one big long panel in the middle, you know, this kind of stuff. But essentially it's, you know, one line going across. It's not too difficult. All right. But if you're doing anything more complicated, okay, come on, Photoshop. If you're doing anything more complicated, like a full page, like for a graphic novel or for a journal comic or for an action comic, you're working with something like this. So let's pretend that this is your page. How do you break this page up into different sections? Well, it really depends on what kind of story you're telling or how much information you want to get out on a page or all that kind of stuff. The easiest thing to do is to divide it into 4 quadrants. So you got one panel here. This reads 1, 2, 3, 4. This is sort of Comics 101. This is your basic 4-panel grid. Not terribly interesting. You know, it's not a bad layout. It helps you focus on what's going on inside each panel, and the rhythm is pretty easy to follow. For anybody jumping into a book that looks like this, you know, you read it this way. This is very easy to figure out. Other variations of this grid, we got the 9, let's see, the 3x3. So we've got, you know, 3 panels here. You know, this is very easy to read. This goes here like that. Okay, so anything grid-like is going to be the easiest, most basic way to lay out a page. And if you're just starting out figuring out how to do comics, something like this is probably going to be where you live. This is your best friend. It's easy to set up. You don't have to think too much about it. It's easy for an audience to get into. They're familiar with this type of setup. You can even go like super Frank Miller and you know, do the whole, break it down even further, like Dark Knight style. You know, have 16 panels on a page, which is crazy. Lots of stuff going on here. But for the most part, the grid layout is your friend if you're just starting out. If you want to, you know, if you want people to hop right in, not get confused, easily read what you're doing, the grid situation is your best friend. Something that happened in the 90s, they called this cinematic comics, which is a stupid way of saying horizontal frames. But people started breaking up their panels like this, you know, lengthwise. So it felt more cinematic because, you know, this is closer to a screen frame, this aspect ratio. So this is pretty easy to read. You go straight down, you know. Sometimes, what's going on here, Photoshop? Sometimes you would have stuff like, you know, a little insert panel here, and then a big splash panel there, and then another thing, and then something down here. But even in this type of situation where you have different sized panels, the read is very easy. You just go straight down. Typically your eye is going to stop here and hang out here for a while because there's more stuff going on in this panel because it's a bigger panel. But you know, this is a fairly easy read. You go straight down. Nothing's stopping you. All right, so that's the easy part. Those are the easy layouts. Let's get into something a little bit more complicated. So all right, what do we do with this type of situation? Does our eye go this way and then down here? Or am I supposed to go this way and hook over here? Because I've seen both, and they're both terrible, and they're both terribly confusing. Because your eye wants to hang out here because it's the biggest panel. There's the most stuff is going on over here, but you're not sure where this fits in the continuity. You should probably have this be the last thing your eye lands on because you want your eye to just kind of hang out with the most stuff. Take a big pause here. But this layout is kind of confusing. You're not sure which way to go. So to fix that, if we still want to have a big splash panel, we can try something like this. So this is a lot more clear about what's going on. You start here, then your eye goes to this one, and then goes down. You can't get lost. You can't lose your way. You can't get confused. All right, let's try another situation. Let's try those stacked on top of each other. So something I've seen a lot in modern comics now is that they'll split a page in half and then do something like this. And then the bottom half will be treated differently, maybe something like this. So we've already seen that this layout is better for this type of thing because it's clear. You start here, you go here, you go down, and you go that. This one, again, is pretty confusing. You can go here and there, or you can go down and up. So to fix that, you want to try something maybe, try something more akin to this. Now, the reason I've seen people split pages in half like this is because of mobile devices. And so you might see this part of the page at one point, and then when you scroll down, you see this other part of the page. You could think about that when you're structuring your layout if you want to. I don't know. If it fits your comic, that's great. If it doesn't fit what you're doing, don't worry about it. But always keep in mind the read. Keep in mind where the eye is going. We go, try not to confuse the reader. So bam, 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 bam. Pretty easy to read, pretty easy to figure out. Okay. All right, let's come up with a new situation. Woo. Okay. This one happens a lot in some action comics. Okay, so this one's a fairly straightforward layout to figure out. We got a big action scene here and some other stuff going on here. So you start here, your eye goes there and there. Pretty simple. All right, so let's say we want to focus in on a face of somebody in this fight, or like a specific action. Maybe like, I don't know, they do a specific motion with their hands, or there's a transformation sequence or something. You can solve that with putting in a little insert panel like here. So because of the placement, because it's in the upper left-hand corner, you know that your eye starts here, then moves to the big stuff, which is going on in here, moves down in that way. If we move the insert panel to the other side, whoop, then this one's pretty obvious too. You start with the big stuff, your eye goes to the little dude, then comes back down here, and then across. So this is fairly readable. This is pretty easy to figure out. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that you want to make it as easy as possible for your reader at a glance when they see your page to figure out where their eye is supposed to go. Anytime they get lost, like anytime there's confusion, that's when they get turned off. So like if you have a situation where it's going crazy like this kind of thing, where do you go? Where do you start? Do you start, well, okay, clearly you start here, but then do you go down there? Or do you go across and here and then across and then down and up and around? Or do you go down here and then up and then down and then across and then down and then over and then... So you kind of want to think of it as a maze, where you're trying to guide the eye instead of trick the eye. So this is an example of tricking the eye. This is an example of guiding the eye through the maze. So you want to help your reader the best way possible. So if your comic has panels, and if your comic is an adventure strip or a journal strip with panels, think about how people are going to be reading your comic. Think about the direction their eyes are moving. Think about where you want their eye to pause. Typically, your eye is going to notice the bigger space. So if you have an action shot that you want to end a page with, and you know it's a great time to show off a big action scene, then put a big panel down at the bottom here. You know, make this your big hoopajou. You know, start off with like little stuff going on up here, like maybe action setup, or you know, you have a face thing going on here, and then more setup, and then you end with the big splash. So if you know that you're going to have something big and awesome and you want people to focus on that, start there. If you know you want to have something in the middle of the page that you want people to focus on, maybe put the big splash in the middle. Like maybe this is an environmental reveal, like, you know, somebody's walking along and they're talking with their friend and they're like, oh my gosh, and they pause, and then here's like a big giant environment thing, and then the last panel is them looking at like, oh my gosh, this is the big thing, ah, it's a big thing, ah, oh my gosh. All right, so guide your reader's eye with the layout of the page. Pretty easy. Now, what goes on inside the frame itself? And we're going to stick with a landscape frame because it's easier to talk about these concepts in a landscape frame. And I want to talk about the rule of thirds, which is something that photographers talk about all the time. I guess people also talk about the golden ratio, but I don't know, man. That's super academic and we don't need to talk about that stuff. But generally, basically, the rule of thirds goes something like this. You take a frame, you divide it into thirds this way, and you divide it into thirds this way. Whoops. So anywhere that you have a cross over here, that's where you want to put the most interesting stuff in your frame. So let's, there we go. So if you're having a talkie scene, you can put one person here facing one way, and then another person here facing this way. Yeah. Okay, and without even doing too much else, you have an interesting composition going on here because these are your focal points right there and there. If you have an action shot, like maybe you have a punch going on up here. Yeah, this is terrible sketched. Punch, and then this person's falling this way. Boom. Oh no, I'm falling. But this is where this is where the hit occurs, and that's the most interesting part. So the rule of thirds is a rough guideline to set up a composition within a frame. You want the most interesting stuff and the corners. The rule of thirds isn't always the way to go. Let's say you have a frame like this, a tall frame. And we can do something like this. We can set up a composition that focuses on the very center. So we can have, you know, a person here, and they'll be talking or something like that. Rawr. Yay! Stuff. And that's a pretty decent composition right there. Rule of thirds still works in this situation. Like you can, you know, move this person off to the side, I guess. And whoops. Not moving everything. And let's see. You know, that's still interesting. But you have some space over here that needs to be filled with something. So sometimes you just want to stick the thing right in the middle. So the rule of thirds, or sticking something right in the middle of a composition, those are some good guidelines. Nothing is a hard and fast rule, but these are just some visual guidelines for you to help things read a little bit more clearly when you're making your comic. There's one final wrinkle in all of this, and that is word balloon placement. Just like your panel layout on your page, you want to guide the reader's eye throughout the frame so that they understand who is saying what when. All right, so let's set up an easy way to do this. Boop. You've got person A talking to person B. A, B. Easy peasy. A is saying this first, B is saying this second. That's easy. Sometimes it gets a little bit more complicated. Sometimes B talks first. How do you solve that kind of situation? Well, first of all, you would want to put B over here where A is, but to solve that, you can put their dialogue balloon over here, and then maybe A is speaking here. So this type of thing, this is not the best, by the way, but this is a way to solve that. It's clear that B is talking first and A is talking second. This is not an elegant solution. The elegant solution would be to switch these two, to switch their placement so that the first person talking is always on the left, but that doesn't always happen sometimes. So sometimes you have to be a little bit creative. Okay. What if there are multiple lines of dialogue and you're having a conversation? So easy way to do that would be to start, A has something to say, then B says something, then A says something back, and then B says something back. And so you hook the balloons this way. Yeah. Boom, boom. So A1, B1, A2, B2. So your eye goes wham, 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 that way. So here's something I've seen that's really confusing. Sometimes I've seen people do something like this, where A is talking here and B is talking here. Now logically, my mind says that A talks first and B talks second, but because the balloon hits your eye, if you're scanning left to right, B hits first. Because that happens, sometimes people make B speak first and A speak second. And this is confusing because, you have to, your eye naturally goes this way, but in order to read the dialogue, now you're pushing up this way. That's really confusing. So you would want to go back to this type of situation where it's very clear who's speaking first. A is speaking first, B is speaking second. Okay. There are some other tricky situations and that we can go over, but I think you generally get the idea. The other thing you want to try to avoid is writing too much dialogue so that like one person's word balloon fills up the entire top half of the thing and your characters get pushed down and like you can't see what's going on. But I'll get into that for the blocking and the setup and all that kind of stuff. All right, that's going to do it for this lesson. Just remember, if you're reading a comic and you're confused, it's most likely because the layout, there's something wrong with the layout, or the word balloon placement makes it awkward for you to figure out who's talking first, or there's something wrong with the fundamental way the page is laid out. So if you're confused, it's probably because something about it is confusing. All right, it's not just you. You're not dumb. You're not too dumb to read the comic. Something about what the person has done is confusing, whether it's the layout, whether it's dialogue placement, whether the blocking is strange, whether, something is confusing about it. So just keep an eye on that when you're laying out your book or when you're laying out your project. Make things easy for the eye to understand, for the end reader to understand. Don't try to trick your reader with your layouts. Don't try to get too fancy with it. Keep it simple, keep it readable. They're going to be impressed with what's in those frames. They're going to be impressed with your storytelling, the way you write your dialogue, the way you draw a thing. They're not going to be impressed with a funky new layout. Anything that confuses the reader is going to put them off and they're going to stop reading. So Make sure your layouts are understandable. Make sure your dialogue placement makes sense. All right, so that's all I got for lesson 1. Tune in next week when we talk a little bit more in depth about placing things within a frame. So thanks for checking this out. And if you have any questions, hit me up wherever you find this video, and I'll talk to you later. All right, bye.